Hey Hidden History fans, welcome back. This is Meredith Hutchison Hartley, and I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to this mini-cast. While we were recording our previous episode on Mary Seacole, Frank busted out this amazing about 7-8 minute explanation of the Crimean War, and we couldn't make the whole thing fit into our episode. We were able to include a few little sections of it, but here is the entire clip unedited. And in it, he lays out why the Crimean War happened, who was involved, what the geography was, and what some of those words we've heard really mean. Things like the charge of the Light Brigade. He also jumps into some pretty awesome Pride and Prejudice references and some of the snarky things that Karl Marx said. So, I hope you guys enjoy it.
Well, the Crimean War is one of those wars that most people think of it only as the charge of the Light Brigade. You know, there's movies been made of it, you know, Earl Flynn charging and killing the bad guy and everything else. It really came about because Russia, for centuries, had been trying to expand south to get a warm water port so that their fleet could enter out into the oceans at any time. Because in the north, their harbors would be frozen solid for several months of the year. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire was in decline. It had been kind of going downhill, and of course it will disappear shortly after World War I. But Russia was looking to expand. The Ottoman Empire was not really in a position to do much about it, although they're still a force. But then you also had the United Kingdom and France, who were looking over there and saying, we really don't want Russia, which is considered to be this great military power, getting access to the ocean. And the immediate cause of the war was the fact that the French were worried about how Catholics were being treated in the Holy Land, and the Russians were concerned about how the Orthodox Christians were being treated. They were both kind of saying, hey, we're sort of the protectorate of these people, and they wanted the Ottoman Empire to treat them better. Well, there was a lot of diplomacy going on. Everybody sort of misread this situation. Great Britain was trying to mediate, but they ended up siding with France. Finally, Russia started making a move in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire declared war, and then Great Britain and France entered on the side of the Ottoman Empire, along with Sardinia, which we don't hear about anymore, but it's one of those places that was in the Balkans. So you had what was almost a world war at that time.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the setup for World War I.
It was one of the causes of World War I. It was going to set, you might say, the table setting for the war to come. And there would be more wars, but it would definitely be there because it showed weaknesses in several of the powers, especially the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Ottoman Empire. The war actually started in the Balkans, as I mentioned, when Russia started to invade. The Ottoman Empire kind of held them back. France and England sent troops. Biggest thing you can say about this war was that it demonstrated the incompetence of just about everybody in the war. In fact, I love the quote from Karl Marx, who described it as, there they are, the French doing nothing and the British helping them as fast as possible.
Ow.
At the same time, it was like a world war because you had actions going on not only in the Balkans, but also in Turkey, or what would become Turkey. You have it in the Baltic, Caucasus Mountains, the White Sea, and even in the North Pacific. But the biggest part of the war took place in its namesake, the Crimean Peninsula, because that was where Russia had the bulk of their military power, especially their fleet.
Can you explain exactly where that's located?
That is in the Black Sea, and it's on a peninsula. It's kind of at the north part of the Black Sea, and at the very tip of it, sort of, is Sevastopol, which is where the Russian fleet was located.
So we're talking really directly to the east of Romania, south of Ukraine.
Yes.
Modern-day Ukraine.
Yes, and north of Turkey. Now, the thing about the Black Sea is that, yes, it's a warm water body. It doesn't freeze over, so that was good for Russia, but it is controlled by the Dardanelles. And that is the little strait between Turkey and the other part of Turkey, which is kind of there next to Albania. In order to get your fleet out, you got to go through there. Well, since it's a strait, it's easy to block, which kept Russia from being able to get out into the Mediterranean, which is what the British consider to be their sea. That is where the bulk of the fighting ended up taking place. British and the French ended up invading the Crimean Peninsula. One example of the incompetence is that when they approached Sevastopol the first day, there's one lieutenant who said, hey, let me go into the city. And his commander says, no, there's probably too many of them. You get wiped out. Well, it turned out there was no defenders. He could have walked in there and taken it the very first day. Instead, you had a siege of something like 11 months. Literally, this is like World War I siege warfare, only in 1853 in The other thing about this war is that it was probably what might be characterized as the first modern war. You had exploding shells, railways being used, you had the telegraph. What this really meant was that news from the front could reach London within 2 days.
That's a huge speed up. We're talking months previously.
Months, and it also means now that the local commanders no longer really have the autonomy that they've had in the past. Because in the past it took months to get word back and forth, and they had to live off the supplies that they had there. Well, now you were getting supplies from the home, and also the home front was finding out what's happening. That really spells disaster for the French and for the British, because their publics are now finding out about the war and the incompetence that's causing it. And one of the biggest things about it, the British Army at that time, you got your commission by buying it. Basically, they didn't have military academies that you go through the ranks, and based on your competence and everything else. Here, you bought your commissions, and this war basically started a reformation of the British Army that eliminated that. Although there's a lot of reformations that were not instituted because the army basically took over the reforms and prevented them from happening. Kind of said, yeah, these are good reforms, and we'll take care of it. And then they really didn't.
Well, and really fast, the whole idea of buying a commission is so problematic because it means anyone with money can rise to any rank they can purchase. And often this was used to get rid of problematic children, to take someone who wasn't doing well in another field, who wasn't suited to the church, or in many cases it was used, well, many, it's hard to document, but there are enough documented cases to show that it was used to take someone who had been causing a lot of trouble in town, or might have a woman coming to claim he got her pregnant, and they would buy a commission to get him out of town very, very quickly.
And that sounds like exactly the kind of people that you want running your armed forces.
Absolutely.
Well, you see this in Pride and Prejudice. If you read the book, they buy commissions and get people out of town. Exactly the situations you're talking about. The Charge of the Light Brigade is probably the most famous incident in the war because it was an example of gross incompetence. Although some historians now say, hey, it accomplished its purpose. The cavalry was supposed to charge the enemy and break them up, blunt their charge, kind of dissipate them. And the Charge of the Light Brigade did exactly that. After that charge, the Russian cavalry said, hey, no way are we going to charge these people because of miscommunications on the battlefield. They were given an order to charge battery, and what the commander really wanted was a battery that was fairly close to them, but they couldn't see it because they were literally in a valley. The only battery they could see was at the end of this long valley. They had cannons facing them, but they also had cannons to the right and to the left.
Oh, dear.
And so they charged. Out of 730 some odd members, about 240 of them became casualties. A horrendous amount. Of course, if you watch the movie, Earl Flynn, they go riding all the way through and they end up smashing the cavalry.
Yeah, but this caused massive casualties, massive illness, massive health needs.
The Crimean War was like most wars up until this point. The British suffered a total of about 21,000 deaths in the war. Of the 21,000, only 3,000 of them died in battle. The rest of them died primarily from disease, which was very common. You saw this even like in the Civil War. A lot of disease, because you have a lot of people back together, poor nutrition, poor sanitation. Diseases would be ripe. And of course...
Which is exactly the place where Mary Seacole's expertise would come in handiest.